Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm continuing on with my interviews/conversations with prominent individuals to talk about storytelling and culture. And if you're new to this part of the format of my channel, these videos get uploaded during the week and don't interfere with my normal commentary that I usually put out on either a Saturday or a Sunday. Also, just to let you know, what you're looking at in the background is some of the art from my new graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes. The link to order that graphic novel is in the description. It is my attempt to take all of the great elements of storytelling and give it to my audience in a concentration on what they want, which is simply pure entertainment. It is an 82-page superhero graphic novel of suspense, epic storytelling, and fun. So if that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. And very quickly, I just want to thank everyone who is sharing the link for my graphic novel as well. Since Indiegogo has shadow banned my campaign, which it has done now for many comic creators, the only way we can get the word out there is by good old-fashioned word of mouth. So thank you all. Now, on to the conversation. All right, this is RJ. So hello, and thank you very much for coming back to my conversations/interviews with prominent individuals on the internet talking about culture and about storytelling. And today I have with me Bennett the Sage of the YouTube channel of the same name, also known as Anime Abandon. And he is a anime reviewer and I would say connoisseur of certainly older anime and an elder statesman of anime and anime reviewing on the internet because he is formerly of Channel Awesome and that guy with the glasses. So he's been around for a while doing this. He knows his stuff. It is a pleasure to have you here, Bennett.
Oh, thank you so much. You're very kind. It's actually kind of flattering to hear myself be called an elder statesman, as it were, especially since I'm only 33. But I have been doing this for quite a bit, and I flatter myself again to think that I am an expert at older anime. But thank you again for the kind words.
So you don't know this, but you're actually one of the reasons why I am on the internet here on YouTube with this channel and why I am producing my graphic novels right now. Because it's an odd story, but I'll try to give you the bare bones of it. I used to play a game called Ultima, and I loved it so much that I downloaded all of the music for it and would listen to it every once in a while. But my old computer crashed at one point, and I didn't have access to those files anymore. And I went on the internet looking for them. And at that time, I just avoided YouTube like the plague, thinking that it was full of cat videos and crazy people, although I'm only half wrong, I think. But I went and looked for those files, and where I found them was I hit Spoonie's stuff on YouTube, which I started to watch that, which then led me to you and to Linkara, and you got me into watching anime again, more anime anyways, and Linkara got me into reading comics again, and from that, my channel grew out of that, and I started to produce graphic novels because I have this channel. So for that, I want to thank you very much.
Oh, no problem. Like, I think everyone who is not necessarily the first generation of YouTubers, but rather like maybe 2 or 3 years into YouTube's existence and they started their career, all have a similar story like yours. Like, my inspiration for basically being who I am actually started from like there used to be a YouTuber by the name of S. Armstrong, and he would just record Guitar Hero videos. You know, like, hey, I hit a high score on Guitar Hero back when Guitar Hero was this huge thing, and I was obsessed with the video game. So I just kind of followed his career as he just kind of grew from just recording gameplay to making little skits about it to being, expanding other content, like he talked about terrible video games. And one of those videos was, like the top 8 worst games I ever played. And one of those games was Back to the Future. And he name dropped the Angry Video Game Nerd. And that's how I found out about Angry Video Game Nerd, the Angry Video Game Nerd. And that's how I found out about Doug Walker and therefore Channel Awesome. And that's exactly, like if that's the seed, as it were, of how I got to be where I am.
So I usually like to start off by asking a fun question, and that question for you, usually I say, "What's your favorite story?" But I think for you, I'll say, "What's your favorite anime?"
Oh, well, I guess on any given day of the week, my go-to answer, without thinking about it, is Cowboy Bebop, because that is one of the only anime that I've ever seen that I keep coming back to. It'll go for 2, 3, maybe 4 years without seeing an episode, or at least seeing some kind of scene from it. But I will always come back to it. I'm like a boomerang. You throw me, I will always come back to that series one way or the other. But yeah, I think it would have to be Bebop by at the end of the day, because one, it came to me at a very formative age for me. Like, I just started to become aware that there was anime that was made for a more adult audience. Most of the anime that I grew up watching was very child friendly, or very, very much like we're selling a toy, like Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, especially. I think I started getting out of that kind of anime when like Beyblade started becoming a thing on Kids WB. So it hit me at the right time, where I was starting to get too old for those shows. But then in comes my neighbor friend, whose name was John. He's like, "Hey, you ever heard of Cowboy Bebop?" And we went to the video rental store. We found like they had anime VHSs, so we started renting those, and that just blew me away, because it was so stylish. It was so different from anything I had ever seen at that point. It was it was a watermark moment for me, as my own personal history as being an anime fan. So I guess in one way or another, I guess you could say that because it was like the first, it's the most special, and therefore it's the closest to my heart, regardless of it's still a legitimately good show. But because it's a legitimately good show that hit me right at that same spot, I don't think any other anime can ever really come close to having the top of my favorites list.
That's funny, really funny, because I was just on your website, your YouTube channel, a couple of hours ago, and I accidentally hit an old video, which was Samurai Champloo, and I thought to myself, I need to watch Samurai Champloo again, because I just love that show. The same producer, of course, a director for Cowboy Bebop, and that show, like you
Director.
for
Yeah.
Cowboy Bebop. Like you, Samurai Champloo for me was something that showed me that there was really a much bigger pot of anime out there, and much more of a adult themed show, kind of niche for me to go to find great anime. So
Mhm.
I just wanted
Yeah,
to
I think that's. Oh, I'm sorry.
no, you go ahead.
I was just going to say that I think that's a very universal. I think it was a very universal part of being an otaku in America, is that you may grow up watching like child-friendly anime, and then you grow out of it naturally. But then you'll find something either through word of mouth or a friend. You come across um, like a show that's more scandalous, that's more violent, or something that's not going to fit very squarely within a Saturday morning cartoon context, even though Saturday morning cartoons aren't really a thing anymore. Not in the days where most of everything you want is on demand on a streaming platform. But regardless, I think for anime fans of a certain age, that was sort of the natural progression of how they became who like the fan that they are today.
So I wanted to talk to you about 80s anime in particular, but before I got there, I just wanted to go over something that I had read, and I haven't read the entire book yet, but it's the book by Hirohi Azuma. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called Otaku Japan's Database Animals, and he's a professor, I do
Oh yeah,
believe.
yeah.
Uh, and he talks a lot about how anime, in his opinion, is much, well, just part of Japanese culture, and its realization and its acceptance of a dominating American culture that came in after World War II, and how much that anime just started to grow out of that and to accept it. And I think that acceptance really took hold within the 80s. Do you see that as well? Because there's a lot of American influences in 80s anime.
Oh yeah, it's actually kind of interesting to go back to the time of Japanese cinema back in the '70s, where every single major movie studio in Japan was just on its ear. Every single major studio was going bankrupt. Some of the most prominent some of the most prominent movie studios at that time were even resorting to making like erotica just to make ends meet. So like when you see like the box office returns as far as like the domestic Japanese films were shrinking and shrinking, American films, international films was shrinking as well, but they were starting to become more equilibrium as far as and how much money they made. So it came to a point where a lot of American movies, from the late '70s into the mid '80s, was actually the predominant cinema in Japan. And you could see that with like maybe not American in this case, but like say Western, like Western movies, like Mad Max came out, I believe. Mad Max 2, I believe, came out in 1983. I'm just using my memory here, but it was huge, absolutely huge in Japan. And from Mad Max 2 or The Road Warrior in America, you get like anime like Hokuto no Ken or Fist of the North Star, or you get a bunch of basically a bunch of anime that was ripping off Fist of the North Star, like MD Geist, or you can let's see, off the top of my head, like another like desert post apocalypse story. But you could there are like a dime a dozen, especially made in the '80s. Besides Mad Max, there was another immediate American influence in anime. Immediately comes to mind is Blade Runner. Blade Runner was another huge movie in Japan. There were like commercials. There were car commercials where they would have like Daryl Hannah's character just kind of randomly pop up in the background as if like, oh, look how elegant she is, and look how elegant this car is. So like it became part of the Japanese cultural touchstone for at least 15 years. And a lot of Bubblegum Crisis was influenced by, for instance, was influenced by Blade Runner. In fact, there was a spin-off of Blade Runner called AD Police Files, where they just wholesale like homage the entire scene where I forgot the actress's name, but Harrison Ford's character is chasing her through the streets, and he's shooting her right through a bunch of panes of glass as she's crashing through it. They homage that scene in AD Police Files. So yeah, there was a huge influence of American or Western media just entering the Japanese pop culture sphere and leaving its thumbprint. And in fact, if I can expand the circle even a little bit more, Araki, who is the manga artist for JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, during his first three chapters, parts 1, 2, and 3, he actually modeled his characters off of American action heroes. He specifically name dropped Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone as the kind of like big muscly bodies, and that was in vogue in fashion as far as Hollywood movies were concerned. So he would just kind of like design his characters to look like those beefcakes. But as soon as part 4 happened, he decided to just let that go, and now his characters are more lively and more spindly, more sinewy than bulky. But yeah, during the '80s specifically, that was the not only the time where American influence in anime was starting to feel more and more prominent, but that was also the time when a lot of anime and manga creators came of age that grew up with anime and manga. So you have an entire generation of otaku basically creating their own anime and manga. Not only do they have like not only do they have like the likes of Astro Boy and Tetsuya 28 and the Eighth Man, Eight Man rather, influencing them and as being a part of their childhood, but they also had a steady stream of more Western movies to help fuel their imagination, and that kind of became the flavor of anime in in Japan, at least from at least the mid '80s onward, and at least until like the late '90s, I think is when it kind of reeled back.
So continuing on with that theme that you just talked about, I find it funny because I watch a lot of isekai now. I try to find good ones. There's not very many, but the reason why is because I think that isekai is very much influenced by the older Japanese fantasy RPGs, and the older Japanese fantasy RPGs were to a great extent patterned upon that game which I talked about at the first, which was Ultima, and it was extremely big in Japan in the 80s. And I think it's the only place in the world right now where its online version still exists. That's how much of a cultural impact it had. And it has that game itself impacted so much of the fantasy games that came out in the 90s and the early 2000s, and then the isekai that were written after that in fantasy worlds. So I see in that sphere not only the movies but the games as well, the American culture running straight through it, which a lot of people today I don't think quite understand the cultural significance and connection between the American and the Japanese stories that occurred within the 80s that really helped shape anime into what it is today. Because I would say that, as you had noted already, that during the 70s, up until the late 70s, there was an economic crisis and there was a recession. So there was not a whole lot of heavy influence from anywhere else, and a lot of anime making was more concentrated on story. Whereas within the 80s and the great turn of the Japanese economy into what they thought at that time was going to be taking over the world, there was just an explosion, which then again stopped during around 1992 because, of course, the economic crash that happened in Japan then. But I would say that the 80s is the blossoming of, and really the origin of, a lot of modern tropes that you get in anime today. So do you, as, again, a connoisseur of 80s anime, see a lot of that in what you watch today in modern and current anime?
I mean, that's basically how a lot of how inspiration works, even outside of anime. Like, just as I said, how the manga artists and animators were influenced by the anime they grew up with in the 60s, so too did the manga artists and the animators of today grew up watching the anime of the 80s and 90s and the manga of 80s and 90s. Like, for instance, Naruto is a great bellwether, I think, as far as where shonen stories um, start from, and all the tropes that are basically linked to shonen anime. Once upon a time ago, that used to be Dragon Ball Z, and Naruto took a lot of cues from Dragon Ball Z. But now, I think a lot of the shonen anime of today are taking its cues from Naruto as far as direct inspiration, rather than going all the way back to Dragon Ball Z, especially since there had been at least I think a 20-year lull between manga chapters between in Dragon Ball Z before, Toriyama went back to the well again. So yeah, so there's like an entire generation who actually grew up with basically Naruto being the new hotness versus like Dragon Ball Z. So they started copying from Naruto, like My Hero Academia, like the idea of children going to a school to learn to be heroes. Well, that's like Naruto, like a bunch of children going to ninja school to become ninjas. And so you can definitely see a direct influence in that. As far as like the character interactions are concerned, and as far as the like personality archetypes are concerned, yeah, like they're basically tracing and following in the footsteps, actually I should say following in the footsteps laid before the likes of, like I said, Naruto and Dragon Ball Z. So yeah, like I think it is a fair assumption that the groundwork that the anime of the 80s can still be felt today in the current anime of the now.
So one of the other things that I really like about Hirohi Azuma's theories, basically about anime and about otaku culture, is he talks about the fact that it's really, he's sort of analyzing postmodernism in a way, and he's talking about how previously there was concentrations on story, whereas what you have at the time he was writing, which I think his book came out in Japanese in 2000, was what he was talking about. I think we would call tropes, that people concentrate too much on the tropes now, and that's what the subtitle of his book is, with Japanese database animals. He says they're just otaku are animals that are looking for tropes. They're trying to database the tropes and follow those tropes instead of following good, solid storytelling. And honestly, I do agree with that to some extent, just because I know that you get the hyper gore and hyper violence and everything of the 80s anime. It's definitely there, where you don't see it after, I would say, the 92 point. But it's there where when you have a massive backlog of really great storytelling for them to draw on and put it over top of.
Yeah, I think a lot of anime is driven on tropes, not just character behavioral tropes, but rather character tropes of visual identifiers. And yes, Ozma did go into how like a moe style usually revolves around hair, specifically hair, like the I believe he specifically mentioned like the two antenna hair. That's very much a visual trope of moe, specifically moe, and how a lot of anime fans are driven. They're driven and are compelled to watch anime with that kind of aligns with something that they're already familiar with, like breeding like, as it were, and it just kind of continues on this train of visual design tropes. So yeah, I think that there is definitely an element of that, and there's still an element of that today, just not nearly as immediately obvious. Especially now that more anime is being made today now than ever has been in the history of anime, because the demand has reached a point where you just need to keep pumping them out, keep pumping these shows out, which again mostly due to digital streaming and the proliferation of digital streaming.
So again, drawing on your massive experience with watching 80s anime, do you think you could distill down some of those tropes that were present there in the 80s anime that made them unique?
I think the first character trope when I think about 80s anime is definitely the man of few words protagonist. Usually he's a loner, like Kenshiro immediately comes to mind. Following that, like some of the anime that kind of aped from it, like I brought up MD Geist. Geist himself is a man of few words, and he prefers to be completely by himself. The Lone Wanderer, especially, I think it's a huge character, archetype for a lot of anime back then. Additionally, when I also think about 80s anime, in specific 80s anime, I also think about a lot of anime loves to be slice of life, and so when you think about 80s anime, you tend to think of slice of life anime from the 80s, and so you get this neat little portrait of the, say, Japanese high school back then. I think about like the good natured girl next door kind of character who constantly berates the male protagonist for being late to school, for not doing his homework, and just basically chiding him about being a slacker. Likewise, I also think about that protagonist, the male high school character who just isn't quite sure what he's going to do with his life. He's just kind of either slacking off, or possibly he might even be a delinquent. Like this is maybe late 80s or into early 90s. I'm not quite sure when the Yu Yu Hakusho anime premiered, but like Yusuke Urameshi is definitely an example of this kind of character dynamic. Like Keiko and Yusuke, that's the pitch perfect definition of that kind of dynamic I'm talking about.
It's funny that you should talk about the archetype of the lone wanderer, because one of the things I wanted to talk about was Vampire Hunter D, because I think that,
Mhm.
again, is the epitome of 80s anime. For me, that would be definitely within my top five of anime if you want to include shows and movies at the same time. And it's the visual storytelling as much as the storytelling that's in the dialogue there that I think is the gut punch for what 80s anime is. It is so visually stunning, and I really don't think you get that today. And you certainly don't get it with anything really CGI. It's starting to get there a little bit with something like Land of the Lustrous, but it's the humanity of the hand painted and the hand drawn and just everything that comes out of 80s anime. Again, I think that's the epitome of visual storytelling. Uh, do you see? Well, I don't know, but do you miss any of that visual storytelling within newer anime?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm alone in missing the traditional cell painted animation, but I understand why that has kind of largely fallen by the wayside because, from a technical perspective, it is a lot of work and it is a very slow and time consuming process. So I can understand why it just kind of it basically became well, I believe the technical it's just become outdated from a production standpoint. It would just be too costly. But yeah, like when I think about traditional cell painted animation, as you said, I tend to think about the anime and animation in general that I grew up with. So I can't help but be nostalgic about it. But I think it's important to realize that a lot of animation, like what you grow up with, rather what you grow up with, you will always be nostalgic for, just given enough time. I have a nephew who's 9 years old, and I try to broaden his palette, as it were, by having him watch some of the animation and cartoons that I grew up with when around his age, and he just really isn't interested in it. He thinks it looks old to him. He thinks it looks not like the things that he grew up that he found organically, or at least he thinks he found organically. It's not like his father just sets him in front of the television and just lets Disney Plus play whatever it's going to play. But but the idea, but the idea of the cell painted animation having, or rather being, more striking, I think is there is some merit to it because you can tell, like the human eye can really tell when something is painted and when something like painted on film versus when something is digitally painted. And digital painting technology and theory has grown in leaps and bounds from when its infancy in anime during the mid late 90s to the point where they have kind of gotten full circle and they're able to help replicate the look of a traditional cell painted animation using purely digital means. Like a recent example I would think is the God, I'm searching for it. I'm so sorry for having to do this, but it's going to bug me until I find this out. It was a mountaineering. It was a French Japanese co-production that I saw about a year ago. Uh, I'm sorry, I'm having to look this up.
That's no problem.
It's all right. Oh yeah, the movie's called Summit of the Gods, and if you haven't seen Summit of the Gods, please go see it because it was one of the most arrestingly beautiful movies I have seen in a long time, and I truly felt like I was watching something that was cell painted, but it was completely digital animation, digital animation, and it made me so happy to see that finally we gotten to this point where if somebody wanted to do it, they could replicate that cell painted look.
That's funny. Again, you should mention that because I know that you're a little bit acquainted with my graphic novels. What I try to do within my graphic novels is to go back to an older style of storytelling, visually as well as within your normal story. And I have some 80s artists from, old Marvel and DC hands working on some of the stories, and they hand draw. They still want to hand draw. I have people who do exclusively digital, but I also have a couple of older artists who hand draw just on paper, and then they scan the entire thing. And one of them also is an old inker, and he still inks his pages with brush. As opposed to digital inking. And I'm very much aware of the color differences that you would get in older comics as compared to what you see today. And I'm still searching for that balance between trying to get it done digitally, which is faster, much faster, but at the same time having that feel, that old 80s feel, because that's what I tried to do with my books. Because like you said, I have a lot of people out there very nostalgic and looking for those kinds of stories, not just the story that you're telling on the page, but visually as well, and even what kind of paper you use. People have conversations and arguments about this. And so it's very much that way with what I'm producing now as well, which is partly why I want to go back to older anime and I want to really look at the 80s and relive them again through watching things that I watched originally when I was there. And it's very, very, I don't know what you'd call it. You just bathe yourself in it and bring yourself back to where you were at that time in order to try to get into that mindset and tell a story that way. But I'm sorry to ramble about that, but
it's all right. It's all right.
I fully know. One of the things about on my channel, I talk about color theory a lot and about how different colors evoke different emotions and things like that, and how I think they're being misused today. One of the places, however, where they're not misused, I think, is in the simplicity of a lot of anime. There is some visually stunning anime out there, something like Maiden Abyss, which I don't particularly like, but it is visually stunning. But at the same time, you get that simplicity of almost an old comic look where you have, a dozen colors and that's it. That's all you're going to see on the screen. So I think there's a place for both of them at the same time. And you're right that hopefully anyways, that the technology is catching up so that we can move backward one from the other. So is there any other anime that you want to talk about specifically that you would think encapsulates that 80s kind of feel?
Like a release that's being either made or released today. The only anime that I can think of that was released rather recently that helped, or rather aped that 80s style was probably Parasite. Which was an anime based off an older manga. It was actually, I believe it was the mid to late 80s that the original publication of that manga. That was when it was originally published, rather, and they had an anime series made for it, like almost 30 years later. And watching Parasite made me realize, like, the story it's not like the story is aged. The story is just, kid gets a alien parasite inside his hand, and it basically turns his hand into a weapon, a la The Thing from 1982. So you can accept it also has a personality. Like this alien parasite actually has a personality. It talks to him. If it's not, it's like if you mix The Thing with Vampire Hunter D. That same kind of idea with the actual having a character dynamic as with Vampire Hunter D. And watching that anime, like I said, like nothing about that story has aged necessarily. You could transplant that story from like the late 80s into like the late 2010s, and it would still fly, because there's nothing about that experience that seems like it could only have happened in the 80s. It was just that during the 80s, those kinds of topics was more, I wouldn't say like hot button, but it was much more of its time, especially after huge cult classic movies and cult classic anime had already kind of tilled the soil, as it were. So like Parasite, but to go back to Parasite, I enjoyed my time watching Parasite, but I don't think that, I think it was like it was a noble experiment more than anything. I believe it only got one season, and then it was just kind of, all right, we're ready to move on.
So I know that, well, with I would say in particular Berserk. They really did not do it justice when they tried to retell the story with modern means. Although it's such a large contrast between CGI and a lot of the single picture scenes that you would get in the original Berserk, where you would just pan over this large area and just listen to, horse hooves or something like that with people coming down. So I think there's a place for trying to take those older stories and put them into a new medium. But again, using Berserk as the ideal, not the ideal, but the worst way, really, in order to do that. It brought the story into a modern audience, but at the same time didn't do it justice. I think the Evangelion did a little better job at it, and there's a few others out there as well. But do you think we're going to see a lot more of that, a lot more of taking older anime and trying to rejuvenate them in a modern visual way in order to bring those stories to a modern audience?
I think that's already starting to happen. Like in a couple of months, the new Trigun Maximum, I believe, or I'm sorry, I might be misquoting the new Trigun series name, but yeah, it's going back to a lot of the older manga. Although Trigun was in the '90s, they're going. There is definitely a renaissance of going back to the older manga and going back to the older properties to redo them for a more modern audience. Like there was already been like a second season of Fruits Basket, which by this point is over 20 years old by now. There's again, like you said, like Berserk. There's which is going to be way more complicated now that Okiura sadly passed away. Yeah, you could definitely. There is definitely a new wave of newer anime based off older properties, and I think a lot is riding on this new, as I said, the new Trigun series that's coming out in a couple of months to actually to kind of test the waters, as it were, for like, do we tap into this nostalgia market, as it were? Do we tap into this directly into this nostalgia market, or do we just continue with finding like the new hotness in the manga, like in the manga magazines?
So if they do that, I really hope that they go back to a lot of older anime that are not as well known, because there's a lot of anime that I only ran across because of your channel. When I was packaging my first graphic novel, what I did was I put you on in the background, and I would just hit a video and listen to your video. And then about 5 minutes in, I would say, okay, I got to stop. And then I got to go watch this. And usually it's on YouTube anyways, and I would go and watch it, and then I would come back to your video. And that's how I spent my entire time packaging my first graphic novel, which got me to watch a lot of older anime that I had never seen before. But there's a lot out there, which I don't know if they would be able to take it into modern audiences. I'm not sure about Japan, certainly not in America, because of some of the ways that the stories were told. Things like, Demon City Shinjuku, or Devil Hunter Yoko, or Wicked City, or things like that. Those were, I think, underappreciated anime, and things that I would like to see brought into a revival of 80s anime. Would you think that that's even possible with the way that things are going today, with that, if to take those hyper violent and sometimes hypersexual kinds of shows and bring them into a modern mainstream?
I wouldn't call it the mainstream. Like those kinds of stories and those kinds of anime are definitely made from a time when Japanese producers were having such an influx of cash that they didn't necessarily care what was inside the like the product that they were selling. They just wanted something to sell. So, and that gave a lot of creative license and freedom to people like Yoshiaki Kawajiri, who directed like Wicked City, who directed Demon City Shinjuku. A lot of Kawajiri's work, rather, I find to be very American. Has a lot of solid American sensibilities. It's very Japanese in aesthetic, very Japanese in aesthetic, but very American in its sense of horror, like in the sense of Wicked City. Like the design of the villainess, who was like spider-like, as it were, has a lot of calls to both Japanese folklore with the the design of the villainess's face is very like a Oni style, but like her body, her spidery body, is very like long and twisted and gnarled, like say from The Thing. It reminded me more of like the slashing limbs of something like The Thing. Um, and I also read a lot of critiques of Kawajiri specifically, mentioning that his style and his sense of presentation is very brash and very much more in line with like an American blockbuster than it is with anything like traditionally Japanese. And I think that's why his work resonated so broadly in the burgeoning American otaku scene in the early 90s. And it's also why a lot of other Japanese creators who also liked American movies also kind of cottoned toward Kawajiri's work, like Hideo Kojima, the director behind the Metal Gear Solid series. He loved Wicked City, for instance. He absolutely loved. He actually led a study, like a study viewing of Wicked City in front of his employees. You know, talking about like look at the presentation of this scene. Look at how the impacts he's filming and how it's animated and how that impact is shown. So like with Kawajiri specifically, I don't think he would have been able to make what he made if he didn't make what he made during that time. So I don't think that his work, or any other work in particular that was made in the 80s, that was very singular of the 80s, could possibly be made today. I mean, even if like discounting like just updating the animation techniques for more digital painted and digital animation, like the sensibilities of it, the roughness of it, yeah, that would like they wouldn't the producers would not give them nearly the amount of creative freedom to allow like some of the more like head scratching plot decisions and sheer amount of blood. You could I think that violence in animation has been toned down for the most part, but it's not like it's impossible to find a really brutal anime. It's just not going to be readily available. You're going to have to kind of go off the beaten path. It's not going to get like the full exposure of the anime commercial market.
So I know my subscribers will probably want me to ask this question. So to give you a little bit of background very quickly, whenever I do a video about anime on my channel, which is primarily about comic books and superheroes, I just get piled on, really. And I don't mind so much because I really want people to challenge my ideas. But I'm trying to come from a perspective of the history of anime, whereas I think I grew up with it in so much as it was there. And someone had said recently that if you went to Japan now and you asked them to pick their favorite anime, they might pick something that's a Disney cartoon because to them, it's just animation. And to me, that's what anime was in the 1980s. I really didn't think or know or have the experience that it was from somewhere else. I just thought it was there and I'll watch it, I'll read it. You know, I was reading, Robotech and things like that. I had a Gundam suit model hanging from my light in my room and things like that. It was just there. And I really didn't think of it as a foreign thing. So to me, it was just part of history. And I think it's a history that's missing from a lot of what the fandom of anime has right now. I think a lot of people don't understand that history. And I know that you had said one time, actually replying to me in the comments, that anime abandon that you do is sort of like an older brother who shows you those things that you missed because he thinks they're great and wants to bring you to them. And I'm really glad that you do that. But do you think there's much more of a need for that in the anime community right now, and possibly that will be fulfilled by taking those older shows and revamping them for a new audience?
I think that is entirely possible and entirely necessary, actually, because no medium that has gotten as far as they've gotten, let's say, like film, video games, literature, has ever gotten to where they are by ignoring the building blocks or ignoring the path that led them to where they are. So when it comes to anime specifically, I think that that a lot of the stuff that got a lot of the anime that made its way over to the states was mainly got there because rather the vast majority of it got there because it was very cheap to license, and because it was so cheap, there wasn't a lot of expectations for it to actually really make a lot of money in the international market. So you get a lot of like one shot off OVAs that were made just by the just because production companies had a lot of money to spend. So like, all right, just make this OVA, go ahead and make it. Oh, it didn't really make that much money. Okay, ship it off to whoever can give us enough licensing fees over in America. And that was pretty much the entire mindset of how anime kind of made its way over to America, and how that was advertised in America as being like this brand new, like, oh, you haven't seen cartoons like this before, leaning heavy into like the sex and the violence and really catering to a young male demographic. So from that perspective, like that's how like anime kind of grew in America. That's how it kind of cultivated itself, at least in the late 80s, early 90s, and then you would get it. Then it moved on from there. But if you take a kid who never, like who didn't know how anime was marketed, who didn't understand, like once upon a time ago, you had to order from a catalog instead of just taking a mouse and then clicking a button and watching it for streaming. It's hard to convey just how much like they're missing. It's hard to convey just like, all right, all this stuff that you could watch and you don't have any time for, like, because no one in this world can watch every single episode of every single anime that's being released right now, let alone over the course of human history. Yeah, like once upon a time, you would get like this little magazine slip saying like, oh, this anime is bloody and awesome, and you send out your $25 for it, or actually sometimes it'll be $30 with shipping and handling, and you get your VHS tape, you pop it in, and it's crap, but you learn to like it anyway because the sunken cost fallacy. So it's like, without that kind of experience and telling them about that and showing them that anime used to be weird and violent and it didn't make sense, but it was so different and it was rough, and that's what made it so exciting and appealing, especially if everything you knew about animation before anime was something like Frosty the Snowman or any Rankin Bass cartoon or just GI Joe. Then this was mind-blowing to you. This was completely different. This was, like, I didn't know that this could be done. And a lot of the times it would never be done like that ever again. Sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. But but every so often, when I think about like how Generation Z and the generation that's yet to come won't ever really know about that, I will see like some 14-year-old or 15-year-old on Twitter just posts like say that that scene from Golden Boy where the hero Kintaro is like drowning in the water, but he's trying to like swim through it, like, and he's remarking about how hysterical that is. And that's when I remember, like, you can't keep like the classics down. If something is funny and if something is creative and if something captures the imagination, it will typically continue to do that, no matter how hidden it is. Like I like seeing that like the other day. Actually, I actually saw that clip the other day on Twitter, and seeing like all the like 15 and 16-year-olds on Twitter just going like, "This is hilarious. Where's this from?" And that kind of made me happy. They just have to. I think that the newer generation has to have the Like they need to feel like they came across something cool. They need to feel like, oh my god, like I didn't know about this. None of my friends know about this. This is awesome. I gotta share it. I'm gonna get some cool points on the internet machine. And then the 30 and 40 somethings just kind of chime in. It's like, yeah, I remember that. That was funny. At least the cool ones do.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about things didn't make sense. And I think that's what's missing in a lot of North American and European storytelling right now, is that there's a message that's trying to be sold to people and they're trying to tell them what to think. Whereas Japanese anime, especially since it came out of a history of a combination with American sensibilities, has just enough of it doesn't make sense for me to try to figure out what the heck is going on here. And it allows your audience to participate a lot more in the storytelling than you're going to get with North American media right now. So I really think that's the future of anime. And as I close out, I want to ask you that question, although we've danced around it a couple of times here. What do you think the future of anime looks like?
I think the future of anime looks very globally minded. I think that it's getting to the point where, if it hasn't already, the international market for anime eclipses the domestic market. That has never happened before, and now it has. So I think that a lot of producers, a lot of major conglomerates that actually own the intellectual rights to, say, like Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, what have you, they're going to pivot toward a more globally sound audience, a global reaching audience, because it doesn't matter how big of a market or how big of an audience you might have in your country, it's never going to be bigger than the rest of the world. And I think that's why a lot of anime is playing it more safe, is playing it a little less like Japanese folklore centric or Japanese historically centric. I think an anime like Demon Slayer, which is predominantly, like, that's Japanese history and that's Japanese folklore en masse. But that series is over. Like, the manga is over. The animated series isn't finished up yet, but the original source material is done. So when Demon Slayer runs its course, I think it will be remembered given enough timeline. I think that's going to be remembered as the last true Japanese anime. The last one that says, that focuses on Japanese folklore and focuses on Japanese history and the aesthetic thereof. That's going to be the last one that reached that real sense of popularity. I think going forward, a lot of anime is going to focus on more universally accepted fantasy tropes. I think that's why isekai has gotten as big as it has, because you don't need to understand Japanese folklore to understand, I have an axe and I'm going to kill this monster. You don't need to understand Japanese or have any kind of understanding into Japanese culture to understand, hey, I'm trapped in a video game, or help, I'm trapped in the past, or help, I'm trapped in some alternate dimension that isn't reality. I think that's a little bit more universally appealing than universally appealing. Excuse me. I think that's why the industry kind of is pivoting towards that. It has already pivoted towards that, and they're going to continue until something else comes its way, because that's just sort of the nature of entertainment. They keep hitting the hot, they keep milking the cow until the cow runs dry, and then they find another cow.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you very much for being here. This was a very stimulating conversation and really helped me clarify some of my thoughts on older anime. I want to thank you very much for coming and participating in this interview, Sage.
Oh, no problem. It was great and fun to be here.
Well, next week I will continue on with my interviews here, and I don't know who exactly I'm going to get, but we'll get somebody. And once again, I'd like to thank Sage for being here, and I will see you all again next week. Bye. So, if you've made it this far into the video, I just want to remind you that the link for my graphic novel is in the description. If you're nostalgic for the 80s, like we were talking about here, or simply want to see those great storytelling elements brought forward into a new story, then you might want to click on that link in the description and go on over and see if my graphic novel is for you. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you next week. Bye.